All right, so for this unit, okay, here it goes. For this unit, we are going to cover the Civil Rights Movement. Now, I know the time period on the slide says 1909 to 1968. However, the Civil Rights Movement that we kind of think about mostly when it comes to history purposes is going to take place during the 60s, the 50s and 60s. But this unit will actually cover the entire Civil Rights Movement. So some of the stuff that we've talked about when we looked at Civil Rights Reconstruction, we looked into Jim Crow, the Black Codes, and you really need to understand that when we get into the actual Civil Rights Movement itself, because you have to understand how it affected the laws, how it affected the movement. So we're going to start with the slideshow. Okay. So first thing that we'll talk about is the NAACP. So the NAACP was founded in 1909, and it stands for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And if you look, this picture here, this is Moorfield Story. He is the first president of the NAACP. And then you also have W.E.B. Du Bois, who is NAACP's first director of publicity and research. And if you remember, we did an activity earlier on W.E.B. Du Bois. Oops, sorry. So the purpose of the NAACP is to promote equality of rights and eradicate caste or race prejudice among citizens of the United States. So they are trying to promote equality of the races. Okay? They also want to advance the interest of colored citizens to secure for them impartial suffrage. And remember, suffrage is the right to vote. They also want to increase their opportunities for securing justice in the courts, education for their children, employment according to their ability, and to complete equality before the law. So what was happening in the 1940s? Let me go back. So if you remember, we talked about this, the Iron Curtain, 1940s. Okay, so after World War II finished, the Cold War begins. Excuse me. The United States was involved in World War II from 1941 to 1945. It originally began in 1939 with the invasion of Poland, but that was the European War. However, at the end of 1945, we talked about the Cold War, which was our last unit, and we said that an Iron Curtain separates Western Germany and Communist Europe. Okay, so this is the Iron Curtain. It splits Germany in half. You've got the Western European countries, and you've got the Communist European countries, which are going to be in green. We also have President Harry Truman. Truman becomes president when Franklin Roosevelt dies during his last year in office. Truman also creates the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. Remember, they wanted to stop the spread of communism. Truman also wins the presidential election in 1948, becoming the next president, and he also continues on with the Berlin airlift. Another thing that was happening during this time, in 1947, we have Jackie Robinson. He breaks the color barrier in Major League Baseball when the Brooklyn Dodgers called him up from the minor leagues. And if you've never seen the movie, let me pause here for a second. All right, so I'm going to end the show just for a second. If you have never seen the movie 42, highly recommend. Okay, so Chadwick Boseman, who just recently passed away, plays Jackie Robinson in this movie. Highly recommend. It's called 42. Let me go back, to the notes. All right, and I can't play the clips because I told you that I'll get flagged on YouTube, so I apologize, guys. And that's another picture of Jackie Robinson. We also have the Executive Order of 9981. In 1948, Truman signs Executive Order 9981, which actually desegregates the U.S. Armed Forces. Full integration, however, does not occur until the Korean War, which we talked about the Korean War in our Cold War unit. What was happening during the 1950s? So this is Dwight Eisenhower. Remember, we said that he was a military general during World War II. So from 1950 to 1953, we have the Korean War. In 1952, Dwight D. Eisenhower was elected president. And then he is also re-elected in 1956. So he serves 2 terms in office, which is a total of 8 years. Now, this is a case, let's go back. I want you to see the picture because this is a real picture. Notice the sign, white women, colored women, white men, colored men. Okay, so everything is segregated. If you notice this water drinking fountain right here, it says colored. So this is what you need to know for you to understand the time period and what things were like. Okay, so this all again has to do with Jim Crow, and it all has to do with black codes. So Plessy versus Ferguson is a Supreme Court case that was determined in 1896. In this court case, they ruled that segregation did not violate the 14th Amendment as long as the separate facilities were equal, which we know later that this is going to be overturned. However, this is something that actually was considered legal for a very long time. I want you to see this picture here. This is Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas in 1954. So these people are protesting school segregation because at this point in time, African Americans and white students were separated. They did not go to the same school together. Notice her signs, or I think this little boy says, "Don't treat our children like prisoners." And this mother says, "We protest school segregation." And notice all these signs say the NAACP. In 1951, Oliver Brown, who is going to be the person representing Brown here, okay, he is the one that is going to have the complaint against the Board of Education of Kansas. So Oliver Brown and other African-American parents filed a class action lawsuit against the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas to reverse the school district's segregation policy. In 1953, the Supreme Court combined the Brown case with 4 other similar cases and agreed to hear the case. So one of the things that you'll talk about in my government class, in order for the Supreme Court justices to hear a court case, they have to have 4 justices agree. It's called the Rule of 4. And typically, they look at previous decisions. They call them precedents, which would have been Plessy versus Ferguson. And that is how they apply their law. Now, the significant part of Brown versus Board of Education is they actually overturned their previous precedent, which was unusual. So, in the case, the NAACP lawyers, led by Thurgood Marshall, who you need to know about, argues that segregation was unconstitutional based on the 14th Amendment's guarantee of equal protection under the law. And this is Thurgood Marshall. In the decision, on May 1954, the Supreme Court announced their unanimous decision by overturning the Plessy versus Ferguson decision. So that's what I mentioned earlier. This would be the previous decision, and ruled that separate facilities are inherently unequal, therefore getting rid of segregation. They also have what is known as Brown 2. In 1955, the Supreme Court ruled in Brown 2 that segregation should end with all deliberate speed. Now, what you need to know, let me go back. What you need to know is that the Supreme Court, all they really can do is interpret the law. They have no power to actually enforce the law. The branch of government that's responsible for enforcing the law is the executive branch. I do want to talk about Ruby Bridges. I just thought about that, but I'm going to have to link a video in the description because otherwise it's going to get flagged. But you do need to know who Ruby Bridges is. Not for the test, just for for yourself. All right, so reactions to the decision. So, Southern states tried to resist the integration of public schools by closing schools or creating student placement laws. Now, again, what you need to know about this is that the majority of Southern states, if not all of them at the time, were Democrat-controlled states, which means that they were pro-segregation, because the Democrats at this time were pro-segregation. They were also the same people who did not punish the Ku Klux Klan. They were the same people who controlled the governments, and they were also the same people who had originally supported slavery. So this group of the Democrats were not going to go with this decision. They didn't agree. Okay, they disagreed with it. In 1956, 19 senators and 77 congressmen signed the Southern Manifesto, condemning the decision as an abuse of judicial power. All right, so this is something you could look into. You could see who these senators are. The senators, remember, those are people who are elected for 6-year terms. They serve in the Senate, and these are 77 congressmen who represent different states. But this is, again, the Southern Manifesto. It kind of sounds like the Communist Manifesto in a way. So, again, reactions to the decision. African Americans, parents in the North brought lawsuits against school systems, challenging the de facto segregation of schools. De facto segregation is not based on laws, but based on voluntary associations and neighborhood policies. So it kind of goes back to zoning in a way. All right, so de facto literally means by fact, okay? So this means that, for example, when we say that segregation is not based on laws, but voluntary associations and neighborhood policies, consider how some people would choose to live by other people. So it's your choice. It's based on customs. So you do have areas, even if you think about across the state of Alabama, even in Birmingham, for example, really in parts of Tuscaloosa, where you have predominantly African-American communities, where people all live kind of around the same groups of people. That is something known as de facto segregation. It's not based on laws, but it's voluntary based on associations. Okay, but we'll get into another type of segregation in just a second. Now, this is the other one we're going to talk about. De jure segregation is segregation that exists because of laws. Oops, let me go back. So, one of the things that I'll talk about real quick. Okay, so one of the things that I want to focus on real quick when we come to de jure segregation, again, this is segregation that exists based on laws. So, a great example of this, if you have looked into the news lately, you probably don't, or maybe not heard about this, but this is Gardendale, Alabama. And so what they wanted to do is they were trying to create their own school system. Now, this is an article in the New York Times. I can link this to the box if you want to read this yourself. It's kind of long, so just, be careful. But it says, what one Alabama town's attempt to secede from its school district tells us about the fragile process of racial integration in America. So, what you need to know about Gardendale High School, or we'll just say Gardendale, Alabama. So the city of Gardendale, Alabama, a northern suburb of Birmingham. So this is a predominantly white community, and they are trying to split away from Jefferson County schools and create their own school system. Now, I'll say, let me Google this other one. So Gardendale school system. What was the result? So, Gardendale won a partial victory last summer when a federal judge ruled that despite evidence that secession backers were motivated by changing racial demographics, the city could operate 2 elementary schools. They are not allowed to desegregate, though. So, this is something that you can kind of look into. This went all the way to the federal court system. So it says a predominantly white Alabama city cannot secede from a county school system that remains under a 1971 desegregation order, a federal appellate court ruled, citing racially driven Facebook posts as one factor in its decision. So, again, they found that Gardendale was actually trying to be discriminatory in actually segregating and leaving the Jefferson County school system, and that is illegal. Okay, but this specific case is an example of de jure segregation, and you will see this a lot with school systems. All right, so again, this is something you need to know about. I'll link these two articles if you want to read them. But that's an example of de jure segregation. Now we got to keep going because this is a long slideshow. Okay. Now, if you've never heard about this before, I highly recommend that you look into this. This is the murder of Emmett Till, August of 1955. While visiting family in Mississippi, Chicago teen Emmett Till whistled. It says whistled. Supposedly he whistled. Nobody can confirm this. At a white lady in a grocery store. 3 days later, two white men brutally murdered him. And this is the same group that were probably associated with KKK. But what you need to know is that this, again, was just based on what a person said. We don't know that it was true. He was a young boy, again, while visiting family, so he didn't understand how things were in the South, that it was pretty bad, okay? Again, this was the 50s. So it says, when people saw what had happened to my son, men stood up who had never stood up before. This is his mother. I don't think I can show the picture because I don't want my video to get flagged. But you can Google the picture of Emmett Till. His mother decided to have an open casket funeral because she wanted the world to see what happened to her son. And see, they don't. See, this is what I don't, they didn't put a picture of Emmett Till before he got murdered. You need to see what he looked like before and after. It's horrific what happened to him. So I'll let you kind of Google it on your own. So what happens afterwards? The two white men who killed Emmett Till were put on trial, but what you need to know is they were acquitted, which means they were not actually found guilty. Emmett Till's murder and the acquittal of his murderers helped further ignite the civil rights movement. Now, I want to say, and I'm again speculating here because I want to say I've read this recently, that the woman who accused Emmett Till of whistling at her later came out right before she died and said that it was not true. So let me see if I can find that real quick. Okay, yes, I did. I found it. So let me show you this real quick. I know I keep going back and forth, but these are all important things that you need to know about. So this is an article in the New York Times. Woman linked to 1955 Emmett Till murder tells historian that her claims were false. So for 6 decades, she had been the silent woman linked to one of the most notorious crimes in the nation's history, the lynching of Emmett Till, a 14-year-old black boy keeping her thoughts and memories to herself as millions of strangers idealized or vilified her. But all these years later, a historian says the woman has broken her silence and had acknowledged that the most incendiary parts of the stories she and others told about Emmett, claims that seem tame today, but were more than enough to get a black person killed in Jim Crow-era Mississippi, were actually false. The woman, Carolyn Bryant Donham, spoke to Timothy B. Tyson, a Duke University professor, probably the only interview she has given to a historian or journalist since shortly after the episode, who has written a book, The Blood of Emmett Till, to be published next week. In it, he wrote that she said of her long ago allegations that Emmett grabbed her and was menacing and sexually crude toward her, that part is not true. Okay, the revelations were first reported by Vanity Fair. As a matter of narrow justice, it makes little difference, true or not. Her claims did not justify any serious penalty, much less death. The two white men who were accused of murdering Emmett in 1955 and later admitted in a Look magazine interview were acquitted that year by an all-white, all-male jury and so could not be retried. They and other suspects of involvement in the killing died long ago. This is a picture of Emmett Till. I'm not going to scroll down even more because I don't know if it's going to show the other picture of him post or after he's died, so I don't want you to see that. You can Google it on your own. But you do need to know what happened. But this was Emmett Till before he was killed. So back to the notes. All right. We talked about that. So you also need to know about the Montgomery bus boycott. This was from 1955 to 1956. Let me show you the picture. Colored waiting room, private property, no parking. Okay, so this is again picture of the busing system. So during this time period, a lot of people rode public transportation, public busing. And Montgomery was kind of a hub for all of this to get around town. People rode buses back and forth to work. You might have remembered December 1955, Montgomery, Alabama, Rosa Parks refused to give up her bus seat to a white passenger, was arrested. Now, that's Rosa Parks, and that's Martin Luther King Jr. in the background. She was not the first person to do this, and this is what kind of gets on my nerves about when we retell history, okay? Rosa Parks was not the first person to refuse to give up her seat. She is the one we give credit to, but she was a person who was selected to do this by the NAACP. This was a planned, organized boycott. Now, the real person, the real female that we need to give credit to for doing this first was actually, I think, about 18 at the time. And I'll show you who she was. All right, so minimizing. The person that you need to know who was actually the first woman to refuse to give up her seat before Rosa Parks was actually Claudette Colvin. Okay, and she has not passed away. She is still alive. She was an activist who was a pioneer in the civil rights movement in Alabama during the 1950s. She refused to give up her seat on a bus months before Rosa Parks' famous protest. Okay, so again, she was the first person to do this, not Rosa Parks. But for some reason, we give Rosa Parks credit for it, which I understand. She is a very famous activist as well, but I'll always remember Claudette Colvin as being the one who actually started this movement. So on March 2nd, 1955, Colvin was riding home on a city bus after school when a bus driver told her to give up her seat to a white passenger. She refused, saying, "It's my constitutional right to sit here just as much as that lady. I paid my fare. It's my constitutional right." Colvin felt compelled to stand her ground. She said, "I felt like Sojourner Truth was pushing down on one shoulder and Harriet Tubman was pushing down on the other, saying, 'Sit down, girl.' I was glued to my seat," she later told Newsweek. She was later arrested for violating segregation laws, including violating for several hours she sat in jail completely terrified. She said, "I was really afraid because you just didn't know what white people might do at that time." What you need to understand is that this was a completely different time in history. And we'll get into how a lot of these civil rights, how the movement really overturned a lot of laws, and now things are so much better. But during the time of the 1950s and 1960s, this was a horrible time if you lived in the South and had to live under Jim Crow. So we'll pause there. Back to the slideshow. Okay. So again, Rosa Parks is the one that we give credit to. However, it's Claudette Colvin who was the first person to actually refuse to give up her seat. So, continuing on with the Montgomery bus boycott. The arrest of Rosa Parks sparked a boycott against riding the segregated buses led by the Montgomery Improvement Association, Martin Luther King Jr. So what they did is they decided to have people carpool together. And that way they could actually, hit into the finances or the money of these buses. Okay. So if all these people stopped riding the buses and stopped paying a toll or, a fee to use the bus system would actually suffer financially. Okay. They would lose money. And really, honestly, that's the way to get people's attention. If you want to really boycott or if you want to protest, you protest where it hurts, which is their money. Okay. Now, I'm not saying, tear things up. I'm talking about quit purchasing from someone like that. And this was very, very effective. All right, continuing. So, instead of riding the buses, boycotters walked and relied on volunteer carpool drivers. Nightly meetings also helped maintain the support of the boycott, because another thing that you need to know, in order for you to effectively carry out a boycott, you have to make sure that your people are organized. And so again, by having meetings to make sure that everyone was up to the same speed and to make sure they were all on the same page, they could keep that, that could keep that protest going. During the boycott, the houses of the boycott leaders, Martin Luther King Jr. and E.D. Nixon, were bombed. This is Martin Luther King Jr. in the picture. King was arrested under a law that prohibited conspiracies from interfering with lawful businesses. This is kind of what they've accused him of. He was found guilty and sentenced to pay $500 or spend a year in jail. The media coverage of King's trial brought national attention and support to the boycott. So again, this is what they wanted to happen. To be effective in your change, or to try to make change, you need to do certain things to get people's attention in an effective way to gain support. In the spring of 1956, again we have the NAACP files a lawsuit in federal court challenging the constitutionality of bus segregation in Montgomery. So this is again how you get laws overturned. Unfortunately, you have to get people arrested. When people get arrested, the lawyers can come in and they can sue. And if they win their cases, the cases are overturned, and it will now legally set the decisions that other courts have to go by later on. So this goes all the way to the Supreme Court. In 1956, Supreme Court ruled that segregation laws were unconstitutional. However, despite the ruling, segregation laws remained in effect in many areas, and that is because I said that the executive branch is the one that is in charge of enforcing the rulings of the Supreme Court. Back to this. The boycott lasts 381 days. I'm out of breath, excuse me. It ends on December 21st, 1956, when Martin Luther King Jr., E.D. Nixon, Ralph Abernathy, and Glenn Smiley, a white minister from Texas, rode the first integrated bus. So they do finally integrate the buses. The first days of the integrated bus service were without incident, but then we get into violence. The calm was short-lived. Buses and African-American riders were shot. African-American churches were bombed, as well as the houses of Ralph Abernathy and Martin Luther King Jr. The bomb at King's house, however, did not explode. There is a specific area in Birmingham that I'll show you a little bit later that was very famous during the Civil Rights Movement. It's actually nicknamed Bombing Hill, and that is because several prominent Civil Rights Movement leaders had lived in that area, and the area was constantly bombed because they tried to, or people, I'll say this, white people who did not agree with segregation or desegregation wanted those people to leave. Continuing on. 7 whites were arrested in connection with the violence, but were acquitted. And what you need to know about acquitting means that they were not found guilty. Their charges were dropped. So, excuse me. In March 1957, Montgomery passes a city ordinance making it illegal for a white and a colored person to play together. So a city ordinance is like a city law, okay? So the city of Tuscaloosa could pass an ordinance, basically, for example, let's say this, the mask laws or the mask ordinances. Mayor Maddox passed an ordinance and said that bars cannot open or cannot be open after, I think, 9 o'clock. He also says that you have to have masks worn on the strip and things like that. So those are examples of city ordinances. Now this to the left, this is part of the ordinance from Montgomery. It is unlawful to play together in any game of cards, dice, dominoes, checkers, pool, billiards, softball, basketball, baseball, football, golf, track, and at swimming pools, beaches, lakes, or ponds, or any other game or games or athletic contest, either indoors or outdoors. This was the actual words from the city ordinance in 1957 passed in Montgomery. So, using nonviolent protest methods. The nonviolent protest methods used during the Montgomery boycott were inspired by Mahatma Gandhi. He was kind of the one that we kind of give credit to for nonviolent protests. He used these nonviolent protests during India's struggle from independence from Great Britain, because India was originally a colony of Great Britain. All right, Martin Luther King Jr.'s protest methods were also inspired by Henry David Thoreau, his essay on the duty of civil disobedience. So this is an excerpt from Thoreau. He says, "If the injustice is part of the necessary friction of the machine of government, let it go. Let it go. Penance it will wear smooth. Certainly the machine will wear out. But if it is of such a nature that it requires you to be the agent of injustice to another, then I say, break the law. Let your life be a counter friction to stop the machine. What I have to do is see, at any rate, that I do not lend myself to the wrong which I condemn." So from this quote here, we see that if a citizen sees that the government is abusing their power, do something about it. Okay? Oh, moved on. Sorry. All right. So the success of the Montgomery bus boycott spurs more nonviolent protests. Now, we get into Little Rock, 1957. The governor of Arkansas used the state's National Guard to prevent 9 black students from attending Little Rock Central High School, even though the integration had been ordered by the court. So remember what I said. The Supreme Court can now determine that the laws are unconstitutional, but it is up to the executive branch to actually enforce the law. So the president at the time, which I want to say was Eisenhower, does not really want to get involved in this, unfortunately. Okay? So we'll look at what he does in just a second. By the way, these students were known as the Little Rock Nine. Yes. President Eisenhower ordered federal troops to stand guard in Little Rock to protect the students as they walked in. But he could have done more. Okay, I'll say that. He could have done more. We also have the SCLC. Again, this is a picture of them marching. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference was established. This was in 1957. Now, next we have Kennedy, who becomes president from 1961 to 1963. Kennedy was a firm advocate for the civil rights movement. So in 1960, Kennedy is elected president. He, at that point, was the youngest president that we'd had in office. In 1961, we have the Bay of Pigs invasion, which all goes back to the Cold War with Cuba and the Soviet Union. We also have in 1962 the Cuban Missile Crisis. And in 1963, Kennedy is actually assassinated. And this was actually right around the same time that Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated, and the leader of South Vietnam. And then, remember, I told you that we go directly into the Vietnam War sometime after Johnson becomes president. All right, in the 1960s, 1964, Johnson is reelected as president. In 1965, Johnson's Great Society agenda for Congress. He also is the first. He sends combat troops into Vietnam, and that begins the United States involvement in the Vietnam War. Again, we also have Nixon, who served from 1969 to 1973. In 1968, remember we said that Johnson decides not to run for a second term in office. Richard Nixon is then elected president. In 1968, Robert F. Kennedy, who was John F. Kennedy's brother, is assassinated as well. He was also trying to run for president. He was also a big supporter of the civil rights movement. So 2 of the presidents that we had that actually was very supportive of the civil rights movement, both of the Kennedys, are actually assassinated. And also in 1969, we have the moon landing. So this is another thing, the sit-ins. Woolworth Company. F.W. Woolworth Company used to be kind of a really major department store. They don't have those anymore. The building in Birmingham that used to be Woolworths, however, does still stand. I'm trying to think what building it is now. I think they renovated it. So, on February 1st, 1960, 4 black college students in Greensboro, North Carolina start a sit-in movement after being refused service from the Woolworths lunch counter. So what happened? The 4 students, Joseph McNeil, Franklin McCain, Ezell Blair Jr., and David Richmond, enter the Woolworth department store about 4:30 p.m. They purchase some clothing or merchandise, and then they decide to sit down at the white-only lunch counter, because back in this time, a lot of these department stores kind of had little, lunch areas. You could go shop and you could buy lunch. So they sit down at the counter to eat. They were denied service and asked to leave. The 4 refused to leave because this is a sit-in. The store closed early at 5 p.m. and they left. However, we continue. The next day, the 4 students returned with more protesters. They were again denied service, so they peacefully sat at the lunch counter from 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. I mean, what are you going to say? If you're somebody who is against them sitting there, what are you going to say? Well, they were tearing things up. They were, that would have actually given the officers or the people around something to get mad about. But if they're peacefully sitting there and not doing anything wrong, then what's the issue? There's nothing these people who own the business could have said, against these students. All the while, they were harassed and heckled by white patrons. So people would actually come up behind them and say stuff to them that were horrible, but they continued to take it and sit there because they were protesting. Continuing on. By February 4th, the number of protesters who showed up to Woolworths had swelled to 300, and these were other college students. By the end of February, the sit-in protests had spread to 30 cities in 8 states. It even came to Birmingham, and they had sit-ins in Birmingham. The results. In July of 1960, Woolworths decided they would serve all properly dressed and well-behaved people at their lunch counters, although local and state segregation laws remain in effect. So they actually made a dent in their goal. Their goal was for desegregation. Woolworths decided that they would actually serve everybody, despite what the law said. The result, again, the sit-in movement spread to challenge many different segregated facilities, from kneel-ins at segregated churches to swim-ins at segregated pools and sleep-ins at segregated motel lobbies. So again, we talked about Woolworths. It was a discount retail store chain that started in 1879 as a 5 and dime store. And this is what you need to know, because this was something that was, my grandmother actually used to work at a 5 and dime store. Everything in the store cost 5 or 10 cents. Now, obviously, with inflation, that wouldn't happen anymore. But maybe you could kind of consider it to like a little dollar store, okay? Or something, a little bit more. So it closed in 1997. During the 1950s, they also incorporated lunch counters inside their stores, so shoppers could take a break from shopping and buy a hot or cold meal. Now we have the SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And remember, I told you that during this time, these were college students that were starting to use to create the sit-in movement. So this was created, and they began organizing the sit-ins. Because if you're going to have a protest, you need to make sure you're organized. That's the most effective way to protest. All right. In 1961, you also have CORE, which is the Congress of Racial Equality, and SNCC members who challenged the non-enforcement of laws that prohibited segregated public buses by riding interstate buses into the segregated South. This is where we get into the freedom rides. And if you have never been to the Civil Rights Museum in Birmingham, I highly recommend you go, because they actually have one of the buses that was attacked, which we'll talk about in this slideshow. But it was actually attacked, and some people passed away. But the bus is actually still in the museum, and you can see the horrible damage that happened after the bombs. So this was the concept of the freedom rides. Remember, I told you that they have to be organized. So what they decided to do, one interracial pair sat in adjoining seats. One African American sat in the front, where local customs and segregation laws required it to be reserved for whites customers. Other freedom riders were spread throughout the bus. Now, what you also need to know is on the freedom rides, not all of these people were African Americans. There were actually white people who had also teamed up to help desegregate the buses. One rider abided by all of the segregation rules to avoid arrest so they could arrange bail for the arrested members. So again, their concept was they were going to ride these buses. One person was going to follow all the rules. That way, when the other people who were protesting got arrested, the one person left over could then post bail for everybody, and they could all be freed and go home and do it again. The Freedom Riders were met with violence in Anniston, Birmingham, and Montgomery, Alabama. Behind the scenes, this was during the time when President Kennedy was still in office. President Kennedy and the governors of Alabama and Mississippi worked out a deal that the state police and National Guard would protect the riders from future mob violence, and the federal government would not intervene when local police arrested the Freedom Riders for violating segregation laws when the buses pulled into the station. Because if you remember, at certain parts of the country, it was legal for them to ride together, but in others it was not, because in the South, we still were operating under Jim Crow. This is an example of one of the young men who was arrested for freedom rides. More than 300 freedom riders were arrested in Mississippi and then transferred to the Mississippi State Penitentiary. So they actually went to state prison. Between June and September 1961, more than 60 freedom riders crossed into the South. And then we get into November 1st, 1961, the Interstate Commerce Commission created a new rule that took effect that passengers were permitted to sit wherever they wanted on interstate buses and trains. Interstate meaning that it goes from state to state. So therefore, really, it would be a federal issue, hence the Interstate Commerce Commission. So this is something that happened. It was a positive. So the freedom rides were effective in this way. They did what they were supposed to do. Terminals and facilities serving interstate customers were also desegregated. So again, they have achieved their goal through this protest. We get into desegregating higher education. So this is now colleges. In 1962, James Meredith, let me go back to the picture. This is James Meredith, attempts to enroll in the University of Mississippi, but he was denied admission to the segregated university. Now, what you need to know during this time is that since colleges were desegregated, what would happen is you had a lot of these lawyers, you had a lot of people from the South who would actually, these are African Americans, who would actually move up north, go to college, get their degrees, and then they would come back and actually try to fight these laws that were segregatory or illegal in the South. So they would challenge the Jim Crow law. So they would move north, get their degree, come back, and challenge these laws. The federal court guaranteed his right to attend the University of Mississippi, and President Kennedy sent in U.S. Marshals and troops to control the mob violence and protect Meredith's right to attend class. So this is what I'm talking about. When something is determined by the court systems, the executive office or the president is the one who is supposed to make sure to enforce the laws. So what does he do? He sends in the National Guard. And he makes sure that these people are protected, as he should have done. So this is a quote by James Meredith in a 2002 CNN interview. He said, "I was engaged in a war. I considered myself engaged in a war from day one. And my objective was to force the federal government, the Kennedy administration at the time, into a position where they would have to use the United States military force to enforce my rights as a citizen, which he deserved to go to that school." After the Brown versus Board of Education ruling, hundreds of African American applicants applied entry to the University of Alabama, but were all disqualified or intimidated into giving up. However, in 1963, Vivian Malone, James Hood, and Dave McGlathery applied to the university, and a federal judge ordered they be admitted. Now we get into one of the famous scenes when we think of University of Alabama, sometimes with George Wallace. So George Wallace is here. He was the Alabama governor at the time. He tried to stop the admittance of the African American students by standing in the door of Foster Auditorium because he wanted to block those students from registering to attend classes. I'm going to go back. That way you can see the picture. So again, this is actually in Tuscaloosa at the University of Alabama campus. That's Governor George Wallace. All right. And this is the notes, just in case you didn't get this down. Another picture of another angle. These are one of the students who was trying to come in to register for classes. President Kennedy then federalized the Alabama National Guard, and Governor Wallace stepped aside to let alone Malone and Hood enter to register for classes. So again, Kennedy uses his right as the executive office to enforce the law. He sends in the Alabama National Guard, and Governor Wallace has refused to he has to step aside to allow these students to register to attend classes. We also have the Birmingham campaign, and we're going to stop a little halfway through because I know these are a lot, so I'm going to break this into two sections. Beginning in April 1963, the Birmingham campaign was a series of coordinated marches and sit-ins led by the Alabama Christian Movement of Human Rights and the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, to challenge segregation in Birmingham, Alabama. This is another thing I want you to see. Let me go back to this picture. Notice that in this building, colored admittance was in a back entrance. There was, let me show you another picture. Let me get out of this real quick. The Lyric Theater that's actually in Birmingham. The Lyric Theater in Birmingham, Alabama. I'll see if I can find a picture of the outside. Oh, here we go. This is an old picture. So this picture of, can I look at it big? All right, wow. Hold on, guys, sorry. All right, we're just gonna have to do this. This picture here of the Lyric Theater, does everybody see these steps that are on the back side of this wall? This was the colored entrance to the Lyric Theater. So white patrons would go through the front doors and they would walk up. African-American patrons would have to go through the back doors, and then they would sit on the upper levels. And that is how they attended concerts. This is the inside of the Lyric Theater now. It's been renovated, but I wanted you to see this picture. This is an example that a lot of these buildings, a lot of these older locations actually had, see, now they've removed it. This was the current picture. But these older buildings actually had backdoor entrances that African Americans were supposed to use, as opposed to going in the front doors. This is the picture of the Lyric. That's Evergreen. That's not the one in Birmingham. Again, this is outside of the renovated in Birmingham. Highly recommend you going if you haven't been before. It's a beautiful theater, beautiful sound. If you're a choir student, or if you're a singer, oh my gosh, the echo in that building, beautiful. Highly recommend. Anyway, back to the notes. There's so many things I could tell y'all. All right. So, did we talk? No, we didn't talk about that. Okay, yeah. So they were trying to coordinate marches and sit-ins. This was, again, the Birmingham campaign. A circuit judge issued an injunction against the movement's use of parading, demonstrating, boycott, trespassing, and picketing, but the movement's leaders refused to stop the campaign. This is the 16th Street Baptist Church. It was very influential during the Civil Rights Movement, and we'll talk about the one of the reasons it's so widely known was because of the bomb. But during this time, it was used as a headquarters where they met and coordinated their protest efforts. Okay, so this was like the official meeting place. I told you that in order for you to have an effective protest or an effective campaign, you need to make sure that your people are organized and they're on the same page. So they would meet at this church and they would go out and actually organize against the unjust laws. So now we have Martin Luther King Jr., who is arrested. Martin Luther King Jr., Ralph Abernathy, and Roger Shuttlesworth. Birmingham Shuttlesworth Airport is actually named after Roger Shuttlesworth. He is a prominent figure during the Civil Rights Movement. Along with 50 others, were arrested on Good Friday, April 12, 1963, for violating the injunction. While in jail, Martin Luther King Jr., read a call for unity, which criticized King and his methods, and in response, he writes what is a letter from a Birmingham jail. And I think that you have an activity that you're supposed to do on this. Highly, highly famous letter. So now we get into the Birmingham campaign and the Children's Crusade. On May 2nd, 1963, over 1,000 African American students, including those in elementary schools, skipped school and met at the 16th Street Baptist Church. If you have not met Miss Hicks at Bryant, you need to go talk to her. She was actually involved in the Children's Crusade herself. And she has a lot of knowledge and history that she can share with you about what she experienced during this movement. So they marched into downtown singing songs like We Shall Overcome. They integrated buildings, and waited to be arrested. This was the point. Okay? The point was to get national attention, national coverage, because most people at this point in time did not want to see children being arrested nationwide. They did not. So when they start to protest and these children intentionally skip school, intentionally get arrested, now it's going to get nationwide attention. The media is going to cover it, and they're going to say, that's not okay. And then they're going to look at the South and they're going to say, what are you doing down there? And that is how these protests are effective. By the end of the day, 1,200 protesters filled up the 900 capacity Birmingham jail. The next day, thousands of more protesters assembled at the church, and they marched downtown. Now, this is where, right after the Children's Crusade, this is where the most notable pictures, the most notable memories from this protest happen. The police meet these children and families with fire hoses and police dogs. And you've probably seen the pictures. Let me find them, and I will show you. Let me exit my page. I'm just putting in a couple keywords here. All right, so these are the pictures. All right, so these are protests that are happening. This is the police dogs that they have. Again, this is just tearing up these men's clothes. You'll see that. Now let me show you. Again, this is Children's Crusade. All right, now let me show you also water hoses. All right, so this is, notice this. Now, if you've ever experienced a, I mean, hopefully you haven't, but if you ever had somebody shoot you with a, like a water hose, a fire hydrant or a actual like police fire hose, that is so much more pressure. That will tear off clothing, that will bruise your skin, that will probably tear off, it's a very powerful force of water coming out of there. So this hurt. For you to see this picture, these people were physically in pain. That hurt to be sprayed with that much pressure from that water hose. So again, this is a very famous picture. I want to say they have made this into a statue, and it's actually in the park out in front of 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. So again, here's more pictures. Again, with the dogs. These are some of the children. And again, sitting here. Notice, see that fire hydrant that fire hose has already ripped off part of this man's shirt. That's what I'm saying. There's a lot of force behind this. So for you to see this, don't just think that they were sitting there taking, like, that hurt. That physically hurt for them to sit there and take that. Again, with the dogs. All right. This picture. This is a famous picture. That hurts right there, And he was trying to shield them too. Ugh. Anyway, so you can look up some of this yourself. Typically when we're in person in my class, there is a documentary that I like to show. But because of a virtual class, I can't show it. I'll get flagged. So I'm going to have to let y'all kind of research this on your own. All right. Let me go. We're going to do a couple more slides and I'll stop at an hour because I want to make sure I can split these into two. It's a lot of slides, but it's a lot of good information. Okay, so we talked about that. Photographers and news crews captured the actions of the Birmingham police during the demonstrations. Images of school children being knocked down by water flowing from fire hoses and police dogs attacking protesters swayed public opinion. This is what I'm talking about. This is why Martin Luther King Jr. was brilliant in his protest methods, because he knew how to get the nation's attention. I told you that even if somebody, up north disagreed or, agreed with some of the policies, most people are not okay with children being attacked or children being hurt. Okay. So they saw this and they thought, this is outrageous. And this swayed public opinion nationwide. It also got the attention of the president. As the campaign continued, protest movement leaders struggled to keep the protests nonviolent, because we also have Malcolm X.